Absolutely. I actually grew up in a little farm town 40 miles north of Sioux City. So I'm a Northwest Iowa boy. Yeah, it was a little town of about 2,000 people at the time. And it was ethnically almost 100% Dutch. So I grew up in a fairly strict Dutch Calvinist community. And somehow I knew from a young age that that was not for me. I decided at a pretty young age to get out. And because of a trip we took to Colorado, I wanted to live out west. I wanted to be near the mountains. I wanted to become a mountain climber. So that was always on my mind growing up. I went to high school there, and then I went to college in Michigan. I served a year as a Vista volunteer in West Texas, outside El Paso. And Vista is now known as AmeriCorps. And so I did a year of, I guess you would call it social work, community organizing, and so on, in a small community where I was the only Anglo in town. I was the only non-Mexican American, and it was literally across the river from Mexico. So that actually inspired me. That year of voluntary service put me into contact with lawyers for the first time. We had some volunteer lawyers from El Paso, some from legal aid, some from law firms, helping us with some of the projects we were involved in. We were trying to get a water system for this little village. So I was impressed with them, and I would spend time with these lawyers, and I would ask them a whole lot of questions about what they did, what they studied. And one of them, a legal aid attorney, even sort of gave me some case books and just walked me through a little bit of what law school is all about. So I got excited about that. And so I went to law school with the idea that I would be able to use my law degree and my skills to do good things for the community. So I ended up going to the University of Iowa Law School, and frankly, I went there because I could get in-state tuition, and it was so much cheaper than the alternatives. I was happy to go to Iowa City. So during that time, I was involved in a number of things, including some community work and some environmental work. I was one of the founders of the Environmental Law Society, so I was just trying to be involved, but I was really busy. I was a law review editor, and it was a crazy time. I really had no relaxation time during law school. In the summer prior to my third year, I actually interviewed with a federal judge out in Seattle. I had a couple of friends from Seattle, went out to visit them, and I interviewed with this federal judge, and he hired me. So heading into my third year of law school, I knew I was going to Seattle, and that suited me just fine because of the mountains. And I also found that the Pacific Northwest was beautiful. So that became my career then. After my clerkship, I joined a large Seattle law firm and worked there for 4 or 5 years and started doing some international business work and decided I needed more exposure to the world. So after 4 or 5 years of practice in this firm, I took a job in the Netherlands for a couple of years, working as an in-house lawyer in a bank in Amsterdam. It was interesting for 2 reasons. One, I got to do all this international banking financing work. Secondly, I got to reconnect, or connect actually, for the first time with my family roots. All my grandparents had come from the Netherlands, so it was just a trip for me. It was such a great time. And I could have made my whole career there. I could have stayed and worked on throughout my career in Europe, in the Netherlands. And I missed the Seattle area, I missed the Northwest, and I missed the mountains. And so Seattle was my adopted hometown, and still remains very close in my heart. Our 3 children are there, our grandchildren are there. I practiced law for a total of 25 years in Seattle, and so, that was my life. But along the way, I did a lot of adjunct teaching. I decided I wanted to do some lecturing, and my clients were kind of telling me, Steve, you might want to be a professor someday because you're good at explaining things. And I took that as flattery, but I also took it as a challenge. So I started doing that. I started doing some adjunct teaching at the University of Washington Law School. I had a chance while I was living in the Netherlands to teach a course at a law school in Rotterdam, and I maintained that relationship for 20 years, where from Seattle I would go back for a week every year and teach a concentrated course on the American legal system. So I kind of got hooked on the teaching, and somewhere around 25 years into my law practice, I realized I was looking forward more to driving out to the University of Washington to teach than I was to going into my law office. So I made the switch, and that's not an easy thing to do when you're in your 50s. The law schools aren't really looking for somebody like you. So I decided to drop out of practice, and I took a Fulbright Award, and I was teaching in Slovakia for a year. And during that year, I made contact with a dean that I knew at Oregon, who sent an email around to the other deans in the country saying, hey, there's this guy who you may want to hire because he's a really good teacher. I had taught at the University of Oregon a little bit. And out of the blue, Pat Borchers emailed me from Creighton. He was dean at the time. This was in 2004, early 2005. I get this email from a law school I had barely heard of, frankly. I mean, I knew about Creighton University, and I knew there was a law school here, but that's all I knew. I didn't know anything about it. And the first email from Pat Borchers offered me a job to come in as a one-year visitor to teach here at Creighton, which I gratefully accepted because it's hard to crack in to the teaching market. It's really hard. And during that year, my position was up for a full-time hire. I applied and got it. So I've been here since the summer of 2005. So this is my 17th year at Creighton, and it's a dream job. I just love it. It's the coolest job possible for a lawyer, as far as I'm concerned. It keeps I like the energy from dealing with the students. I like being with a younger generation. Actually, I'm old enough to be the grandparent of most of my students. But I like the energy. I like the energy in the building. I like the intellectual activity going on around me. I love learning new things from my colleagues on the faculty. There's just so much stimulation going on of a really positive kind that I found my niche. I really like being a law professor. Look, I had a great time. I wouldn't have practiced law for 25 years if I hadn't enjoyed it. And I had a wonderful practice. But here I am having a good time. Immediately, because when Pat Borchers hired me to come in as a visiting professor, he said, there are a couple of courses we really want you to teach. One is legal ethics, and the other is business associations, basic corporate law. And I thought, that's interesting. I've never taught either one of those. I had, as an adjunct, taught comparative law, European Union law, international business law. So I came in my mind as kind of an international specialist, and I have been here on the Creighton faculty. But yeah, one of the first courses I had to teach, and it was either the first or second semester of that year, was professional responsibility. To be perfectly honest about it, in all my years of law practice, I had barely paid attention to the rules of professional ethics. My approach to ethics was, if it doesn't seem right, if it doesn't smell right, don't do it. And of course, as a lawyer, we had had to deal with ethical issues within our law firms or with lawyers in other firms. So I wasn't ignorant about the field of legal ethics. I had just never paid that much attention to it. So I had to do a deep dive into ethics in order to teach the course for the first time. And it was really enjoyable. it turned out to be great, and I'll tell you why. For one thing, it's very concrete. That is, you've got a set of rules of professional conduct that are logically organized and reasonably detailed, and I think they hit the mark. I think they do what they need to do. Now, they always have to catch up a little bit with the real world, and so the rules are evolving as law practice evolves. But I like that black letter law aspect to it. It's quite different from teaching a case book where you're teaching common law. This is statutory law. So I like that aspect of it. And the other thing was, coming out of 27 years of law practice, I had sort of seen everything in terms of lawyer behavior. Now, I had not been a litigator, although I had partners who were litigating, and so I was kind of familiar with some of the tactics that litigators engage in, but mostly I just had a good feel for how lawyers function, how they hire, how they are hired by their clients, how they deal with their clients, how they bill their clients, and all of those things. And so I found that in my classroom, teaching legal ethics, I could bring the real world right into it. I mean, it's one thing to look at a law, or in this case, a black letter rule of professional conduct. That's one thing. But to then say, this is here for a reason. This is logical, and this is how lawyers behave. And so let's talk about this particular rule. Let's say the rule of conflict of interest, Rule 1.7. Let's talk about conflict of interest and how does that play out in practice. So we can spend a lot of time in my classes talking about the real world and how ethics impacts you. So that was my re-education in ethics. 25 years after I got out of law school, I was re-educated in the field of legal ethics by having to teach it. And as I've always maintained, the best way to learn something is to volunteer to lecture on it or to teach it, because it scares the dickens out of you to have to teach something, and you want to know 10 times more than you need to do the teaching. And so I always find teaching something new to be an excellent learning experience. But that's sort of my background on how I got to do the teaching. Yes, yes, and yes. The Washington State Bar was a few years ahead of Nebraska in requiring CLE credits. And I can't honestly tell you, but I believe that from the very beginning, ethics were part of that requirement. I will say that the requirement now, and I'm still a member of the Washington Bar, and that's my only bar membership now, I have to get 15 hours of CLE credits every year, 2 of which have to be ethics, and I have to report every 3 years. So at the end of this year, I'm at the end of a 3-year cycle, and I can tell you I'll be scrambling to get my 45 credits. Actually, I have gotten most of my credits over the years by presenting at seminars. I think if I present for 45 minutes, I'll get 5 hours of credit or something like that. So if I present a couple of times a year, that usually actually gets me into my 15 hours. I just have to sit down and start calculating, and I fear I'm going to have to get online and start taking online courses. Yeah, so when I started at Creighton and Pat Borchers asked me to teach legal ethics the first year, I believe it was then the following spring. When did these start? In 07 or 06? Help me out. Well, anyway, I believe it was during that, somewhere in that first year or second year here at Creighton, Pat Borchers must have been having a discussion with the OBA and coming up with the idea to do this seminar, and he simply tapped me to be the Creighton person So it was Scott Paul and myself and leadership of the Omaha Bar Association. We put it together the first time, and we did it here at the Law Building, and we had a remarkable turnout. I think we had something like 100 people showing up for this thing, and it only got bigger after that. Eventually, we had to move into the Harper Center, where we would get, 300 people or something signed up at a time. So there was an instant need for it, and yes, that happened at the time that the CLE credits became mandatory here in Nebraska, and so we felt, that is, the OBA and the Creighton Law School collectively felt that would be a service to the bar that Creighton could participate in and the Bar Association could participate in. And what I am particularly pleased about in the whole thing is that it's offered free to the OBA members. I mean, really, in most instances, if you want to go to a CLE seminar, you have to shell out money. And I think we get the big turnout because it's a fairly compact and easy way to get your 2 hours of ethics credit every year. And so we have the same people coming back over and over again. So I think it's a big success because there's the need for it, and we have a good setting, and the leadership of the seminar, other than myself, has been really great. I've been there representing the law school, and I'm happy to be involved in it. I'm proud of what we've put together, but I give most of the credit to Scott Paul and to the Bar Association people because I think they deserve it. Well, if you think about it, 300 people attend every year and they get 2 hours of credit. That's 600 hours a year. Multiply that times 15, 16 years, and yes, you get up to 10,000. I think it's a wonderful idea that bar associations or state Supreme Courts everywhere are requiring ethics credits. I really think that's critical because, as I said, during my 27 years of law practice, I was only dimly aware of the rules of ethics. I knew what ethical behavior meant, and I had taken ethics in law school. But as an organized system and as a set of rules, I wasn't even paying attention to it. I suppose I might have made some mistakes along the way, but I would say an honest spirit and attention to detail and following the golden rule will get you most of the way to being in full compliance with the rules of ethics. And my law firms handled things like client trust accounts, which are technical and not intuitive, but my law firms took care of that. So I know I was always in compliance. It's just that I think it bears reminding year by year by year, and that's why I think the requirement of yearly ethics credits is excellent, because I think you just have to tell yourself every now and then, oh yes, there's all these rules out there, and let's be aware of what they are. So when I gave my presentation last year, in the spring of 2021, I did an overview of the entire set of rules. I actually managed to mention in 45 minutes every single one of the rules of professional conduct with a quick comment on them. But I think that bears repeating, because if that doesn't happen, you're not going to remember all those rules that are out there. So it's an interesting field, and I think all lawyers ought to be interested in legal ethics. It's something that we have that most careers don't have. Business people, yes, there's a thing called business ethics, but they don't have a rule, a set of rules of conduct that they must follow, or they're not going to be able to do what they do any longer. I think the power behind these rules is that they're mandatory, and your keeping your law license depends on not making a major violation of the rules. So I like the system that we have, and I think lawyers don't get enough credit for the the serious ethics that we have in our profession. But that's life.
And it's well stated, that the nobility of the profession is in large part because we hold ourselves to this higher standard, right?
It is. And I remember when I was in law school taking a course in legal ethics. It wasn't actually even called that. It was called lawyering or something. I mean, and we did go through the old code of professional responsibility, which predated the rules we have today. And it was this sort of easygoing older professor standing in front just telling stories. He didn't really concentrate on the rules, although I had to relearn them to pass the bar exam. But he talked about law a lot as a learned profession. And he talked about the fact that there are a few professions that are recognized as being learned. Theology, being a minister or a priest, medicine, other aspects of the field of medicine, law, and that's, it's a pretty short list. But learned profession, meaning you have to go through a lot of years of training to get it, and you are subject to a higher standard of conduct, a professional code, if you will. So yes, I think that's something we have to be proud of, and I think it's something we have to constantly take seriously. So you've asked whether the Nebraska rules are up to date, so to speak, with other trends. Well, there is one area, and I pulled it out here, and I'm looking at Rule 1.6 on confidentiality. The Nebraska rule gives a few instances in Rule 1.6b where a lawyer may break confidentiality. And there's the one that's critical here is to prevent the client from committing a crime or prevent reasonably certain death or substantial bodily harm. All right. The model rules have expanded that. And this comes out of the Sarbanes-Oxley legislation, which was a response to Enron and WorldCom, where it turned out that lawyers and accountants had been sitting on a lot of damaging information that could have saved people a lot of money. And so it started with the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, amending rules of ethics for practice before the SEC. But the ABA jumped on board, and so now the model rules allow you to reveal confidential information. It's not mandatory, but you may reveal confidential information. It says to prevent, mitigate, or rectify substantial injury to the financial interests or property of another. So the old exception, which is still the rule here in Nebraska, is that you could reveal confidential information to prevent bodily harm. Under Sarbanes-Oxley, to try to help prevent massive financial fraud, you may reveal confidential information to prevent, essentially, financial fraud. So I think that's one area that's in development, and I expect our model rules here in Nebraska will catch up with that soon. There's another trend that I've just have been watching, and that's because it's happened in Washington, where I'm a member of the bar, but it has to do with solicitation. In the rules under Part 7 of the rules, you're not allowed to directly solicit legal work from people. Direct contact with prospective clients is Rule 7.3. Washington has kind of done away with that. It's always been confusing, and it's always been something that I think a lot of lawyers have chafed under that rule. And it's to protect innocent people from the ambulance chasing attorney who meets them in the emergency room in the hospital.
Danny DeVito.
Danny DeVito,
Right.
yeah. So it's to avoid that problem. Well, that meant that literally you couldn't sit down at the Rotary Club or the Kiwanis Club over lunch and talk to this business person next to you and say, you know, my firm does this and this. I think we could, we'd love to have you as a client. That would have technically been a violation of the non-solicitation rule. Well, Washington has kind of thrown that out the door, and I don't have that language here in front of me. They've thrown that out in favor of a full permission to do solicitation as long as it doesn't involve duress, and as long as the client's not in a comfortable position or the client says they're not interested in hearing about that from you. So I think that rule it will bear watching to see how that plays out, but that's another trend that I think is likely to work its way into the rules around the country at some point. I think that makes sense.
And ran with it?
Well, I hope they do. I won't be able to do this forever, and I hope there are lots of Scott Pauls out there in the community who are ready to make ethics presentations. You know what, Dave? I'm certain that any number of my former students have made presentations in CLE programs here and there, and I would be quite surprised if ethics hadn't been one of the topics that they might have presented on, because our little seminar of 2 hours a year in the springtime doesn't begin to define all the ethics presentations that go on. It's interesting, in Washington, for example, if you have a CLE seminar, say 6 or 7 hour seminar, the rules are that one of those hours has to be ethics. And so an ethics hour is built into every seminar. And so that means that there's lots of lawyers out there presenting on one aspect or another, whether it's estate planning or criminal defense or whatever it is. There's lots of lawyers then who have to jump in and fill that ethics hour. So I cannot actually name you the names of any of my former students who would have been doing that, but they're out there. Washington is now adding an ethics requirement, and I don't know if it's a half hour per year or an hour per year, of diversity and inclusion issues into the CLE. Now, I don't see that as a black letter ethics rule. I see that almost more as a professionalism rule and more as a legal requirement based on Civil Rights Act and all kinds of acts that prohibit discrimination. And I think lawyers need to be updated on that from time to time. So I appreciate that one. As to wellness, I'm a big fan of wellness. I mean, goodness, yeah, my skis are sitting here in my office, but I don't necessarily see that as a substitution for ethics rules. I don't know. I mean, there's only so many hours that we have that we require, and we hope that most of those hours are of CLE are spent in beefing up your legal knowledge. Having an ethics requirement is vital as far as I'm concerned. I mean, that's part of your legal system. As to wellness, I'm 100% in favor of asking attorneys and maybe even requiring them to hear presentations, for example, from the Lawyer's Assistance Program on substance abuse and that type of wellness, so that you can recognize it in yourself in the people you work with and in your clients and others. So I think that's a vital thing. And when I teach legal ethics, I always have someone from the Lawyer's Assistance Program come into the class and talk, and that may even be a requirement. But that's a natural thing to do. I don't know how far the wellness training is going to go, but if they're going to give me an hour of CLE credit for yoga, I'm in. I'm in for sure. If I can sit on my mat for an hour and do some deep breathing and stretching and get a CLE credit for that, you sold me on that.
Especially with 45 hours to get in by the end of the year.
I could do 45 hours of yoga every year and take care of everything. Well, thank you. No, thanks for asking, because deep in my soul, I'm a writer. I was an English major in college. I got a master's in English. I had to pretty much push that aside in order to be successful as a lawyer. I did a lot of writing as a lawyer, but it was not entertaining writing. No, one of the reasons I wanted to go into teaching is because I knew I would have more time for writing, and I anticipated I would have my summers free, if nothing else. But to get started in your teaching career, you're going to publish a lot of legal articles to get things rolling. At some point, I realized that I just had to write that first mountain book. I've been dreaming about writing that book my whole life. And so I wrote this story, and it's got a great title, The Naked Mountaineer, and it's about climbing that I did around the world. That was just a labor of love, and you've read it, and yes, it's a lot of fun. It's a fun book. The second one was about a 90-day road trip that my wife and I took around the British Isles, and kind of the travel adventures, but I also climbed a lot of mountains in Britain that year. So the third one is going to be a novel, and I'm happy to announce I've written this novel, and I am on the verge of getting it published. In a few weeks, I'll know whether a particular publisher that is looking carefully at it right now is going to accept it. That's another one of those stories I've wanted to tell my whole life, because it's a coming-of-age story in a small conservative farm town, and trying to grow into being your own person, and frankly, trying to escape what you see as the clamps that are put on you by a fairly rigid environment. So I'm enthusiastic about that book, and actually my next project is just starting out. I'm outlining it right now. I'm going to write a young adult novel about dealing with children who are different.
Okay.
And so I don't know that may have as much humor as some of the others. I hope I can do that. In my soul, I'm not a serious guy. And if you read either of my travel books, you know I don't take myself seriously. I laugh at myself a lot, and I think life's a hoot.
I'm very excited about the novel coming up here. We'll keep our eyes peeled for that, and we'll push it on social media.
Thanks. I'll let you know for sure. I hope I'll know by the end of April whether it's been accepted for publication. It's under serious scrutiny right now by a publisher that's interested in it.
I think I asked this question 2 years ago, but I got to ask it again. Your writing process. What is that like? Are you I got to get 500 words a day, or is it?
Oh no, I'm pretty random. I'm pretty random about that. If I get on a roll, and I'd probably give you the same answer that I gave you a couple of years ago. If I'm on a roll, I'm really rolling. But if I write 1,500 words a day, it's going to take me 3 days to edit it. if I write 500 words a day, they might be good enough to not need too much editing. But there's a limit to what you can write without just throwing words out. But my process is to really, really think through the story. And I was, for example, just this morning meeting with a professor here at Creighton in the Department of Education to talk about autistic children. Now that we say on the autism spectrum. And because in this young adult novel I want to write, there's a central character who has symptoms that look like either autism or possibly abuse, and the people don't really know what it is. And this is in the 1950s, where a lot of the analysis hadn't been done yet. So I'm doing my background research on that, and I'm reading a lot of articles about autism spectrum. And so I tend to do a lot of research, even just to come up with a random paragraph in a story. I want it to be right. So there's the lawyer in me. There's the lawyer. I can't stop being a lawyer. Hopefully my writing doesn't sound like legalese. Hopefully my writing flows and is light compared to my legal writing. But so I work hard and I outline and I outline and I put things on little cards and I spread them around the table or tape them to the wall and look at them from 5 feet away and think, I think I'll move this card over here. So it's a storyboard approach, the way television and film producers use. But I'm really, really organized about this. But then when I start writing, I have to remind myself, let it go, let it flow. Don't try to say everything. Learn 10 times as much as you need to write this paragraph. But no, I take it seriously that you can't just make things up. Excuse me, you can't just make things up that have some kind of historical or scientific basis. You've got to be accurate that way. But then the material is yours. Then you can do with it what you want. And I was talking to this education professor, and we're trying to get some of the details right as to how an autistic child might behave. And we were really going at it, and this was quite interesting to me. And then I backed up and I said, but with that information, I've got to tell a good story. It has to be a good story. It has to be entertaining, if you will. It has to be interesting, and it has to drive you to flip the page and keep going. So that part of being a writer is hard to teach, and it's hard I think for most people to do. And I'm not bragging there, but some people have a knack for writing interestingly, and that may show up in their professional writing or wherever. But I've always known I could write, and I've always wanted to write. And now, at this stage of my career, I am creating blocks of time, especially in the summers when I'm not teaching. I'm creating blocks of time to write anything I want. On my own?
Yeah.
Well, no, but here I go again, because I now have a half dozen or more young adult books. And these are award-winning young adult books going back 40 years, but I picked out, with the help of the nice people at the Bookworm, I picked out from their award-winning shelf half a dozen books that I'm not just reading, but I'm outlining and I'm marking up, and I'm really going through them. So pleasure reading like that is also research for me. But so that's maybe more research than pleasure reading. I'm a big John Grisham fan. I don't think I could write a legal thriller the way he does. I don't know. I mean, I've had lots of thrills, but I think Grisham's an extraordinary writer. Now, his writing is for a popular audience. It's not considered literary heavy writing or anything like that. But just to sit down and relax and enjoy a book, I love John Grisham and lots of others. Yeah, let me say one thing, and I may have said this in a previous interview. From the first days that I arrived, or the first weeks or months that I arrived in Omaha, I arrived in the summer of 2005. I have been so impressed with the quality of the bar in this city, the professionalism. Coming from the West Coast where things were starting to get pretty casual, it was amazing to me to show up at a lawyer event like the fall kickoff barbecue out at First National and see all these people standing around in suits. So interesting to see. But it isn't just the clothing, but I think the clothing represents a seriousness. And I think the bar here takes itself very seriously in the right way. And I've dealt with lawyers on a number of things, whether it's planning a program or I've been an expert witness on a number of occasions for legal ethical matters. And just watching these lawyers carry out their work in a deposition or this or that, I'm so impressed. I'm so happy to be a part of a legal community like that. So as an outsider coming in mid to late career and moving into a new community and starting to get to work with lawyers in this community, I've just been constantly pleased to have that quality of professional peers around me. It's a great community.